Come back to our beloved daf. It's hard, it's hard on a day like today where there's so much. And the truth is, all I want more than anything is my daf, right? Because the daf is the anchor, the daf is what holds us. So we have to wait, but Baruch Hashem, the wait is going to be worthwhile. So I must say, today's daf is Lamed Beis 32. We are picking up at Meretz Hashem at Lamed Aleph Amud Beis 31b. Was this for today? Okay, so Yashkach to our Daf Yomi sponsors, to our Talmud Torah sponsors, Paul and Kathy Pollack, in honor of their grandchildren, our Daf Yomi Shur and Schus of Refuah Shalema for Yehuda Ben Michal, and our Week of Learning sponsors, Gail and Doug Stanger, a mazel tov to their grandson, Akiva Leib Weinberg, on his bar mitzvah this coming week, B'Sha'a Tova U'Mitzlachos. With that, let us begin. So today's daf is Lamed Beis. We actually left off on Lamed Aleph Lamed Beis 31b, and we left off, Rabbosai, actually at V'tarvayhu b'diyuka dehamas nisin. So just it's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 19 lines up from the bottom, but it goes quickly. So the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says V'tarvayhu b'diyuka dehamas nisin kamiflagi. And ultimately, again, the two opinions we quoted before, Rav Ashi and Rava, ultimately are being medaik in two different parts of the Mishnah. What are the two different parts of the Mishnah? This none. So we'll say, remember again, we're dealing with the following situation. We're trying to figure out a case where you could come up with kimle b'derabimine, to come up with a case, ultimately again, where you could avoid or potentially have simultaneous liability or avoid simultaneous liability. So let's listen to this case. Imagine for a moment it's Shabbos, and you were going ahead and stealing an animal from someone, and you're pulling the animal out of their reshus. So the Gemara says, if you're pulling the thief is pulling the animal out, and the animal dies in the domain of its owner, pater. Ultimately, again, the thief is pater. Why is the thief pater? Because at the end of the day, he has not really stolen the animal, for the animal has never left the domain of the owner. However, if the thief lifted up the animal, or he removed it from the reshus of the owner, and then the animal died, the thief will be chayiv. Ravina daik mereisha, Racha daik miseifa. Ravina was medaik from the beginning of the Mishnah. Ravacha was medaik from the Seifa. Ravina daik mereisha. Ravina was medaik from the beginning of the Mishnah. Haya moshcha v'yotze umeis pirshos bailim pater. If the thief was going ahead and stealing and trying to remove the animal, but the animal died in the reshus of the owner, ultimately the thief is pater. Why? Time of the meis pirshos bailim. The reason ultimately why the thief is pater is because the animal died while in the domain of the owner. But you see from here that if halacha l'maisa, the person took the animal out from the reshus bailim and it died, you'd be chayiv. Ravacha daik miseifa. Ravacha was medaik from the seifa. Higbiu oshet tziu. The Mishnah said, last part of the Mishnah, if he picked it up or he removed it from the reshus bailim, hotza dumya dahagba. The Mishnah is equating removal and picking up. Mahagba de asilir shusei. Just like Hagba lifting it up, it comes into the domain of the thief. Af hotza nami de asilir shusei. So to removal has to be coming into the domain of the thief. The Ravacha kashya reisha, the Ravina kashya seifa. According to Ravacha, there's a problem with the reisha. According to Ravina, there's a problem with the seifa. Reisha the Ravacha lo kashya. As long as the item has not come to the domain of the thief, ultimately is considered to be in the domain of the owner. Seifa the Ravina lo kasha, the seifa is not kasha to Ravina. Hotza dumya de hagba lo amrina. We do not equate hotza with hagba. Good, I will say. So at the end of the day, that's the end of that sugya. Just to understand what we took from this whole thing was an entire discussion of kimle b'derabimine. So remember again, I will say, let's just quick review. Kimle b'derabimine means what? I go ahead and commit an act. The act results in dual liability. Capital liability, financial liability. What's the halacha? You're chayiv for the capital case, for the capital punishment, but exempt from the liability. I will say, but when it comes to kimle midirabimine, the most important concept is simultaneity. In other words, kimle midirabimine only applies where both punishments are incurred simultaneously. But if one is incurred one after the other, then halacha l'maisa, what's the halacha? You'll be chayiv both. So I'll say all we were doing in that last sugya was kind of going through some of these cases and highlighting how you could come up with certain cases of simultaneity and ultimately which were simultaneous, which weren't simultaneous. Beautiful. Let's go weiter. A person has relations with his sister. It doesn't feel like a good way to begin the new, but all right, fine. As I say, good. So what's happening over here? So let's go back to our Mishnah. So the Mishnah was talking about the case of kinas. A man goes ahead and violates a woman. So the Mishnah said that halacha l'maaseh, even if a person violates his sister, our Mishnah paskind that there's kinas, that ultimately there's a penalty payment. They're both saying, now what was the svara? Why does the Tana of our Mishnah hold that if a man violates his sister, there's a kinas? Why? Why? Because remember, what's the penalty for violating one's sister? Kares. Our Tana holds that the concept of kimlein b'derabamine does not apply to kares. It only applies to what? Right? Chayve misa and bezdin. Right? Only death penalties carried out in the bezdin. But kares misa b'dei shamayim, there is no din of kimlein b'derabamine. That's why our Mishnah holds that if a man violates his sister, he's going to have to pay the knas, even though he is subject to kares as well. Says the Gemara. Let's analyze. Or mini areza kasha elohein alokin. These are the people who get malchus. What's an example of a case that gets malchus? So the Gemara says, Haba al achosov al achos aviv. If a man has relations with his sister, his father's sister, achosimo, his mother's sister, al achosishto, his wife's sister, ba'al eishes achiv, his brother's wife, ba'al eishes achi aviv, or, this is his aunt, the wife of his father's brother, ve'al hanida, or an anida. They both say, we're only hyper-focused on one case, which is what? Which case? Sister. What did the Mishnah both say? Now again, remember, this is a Mishnah from Meseches Makos. So what did the Mishnah just say? That if you go ahead, man violates his sister, what's the halacha? He gets malchus. He gets malchus. Now both say, I want to point out something very interesting over here. The Gemara says, V'kaimalon, top of Lamed Beis, V'kaimalon, de'ena loke u'mishalin. Now both say, so we know that there is a principle from Meseches Makos. And what's the principle from Meseches Makos? You don't get malchus in payment. I will say, for some of us, like, malchus is usually one of those mesechtas you learn in high school, or, so this concept of ena loco mishalim is like a famous concept. You can't get malchus and pay. Can't get malchus and pay. So we'll say, now we have a problem. What's the problem? According to the Mishnah in Makos, if a man goes in and violates his sister, what's the halacha? What's the halacha? Malchus, and because there's malchus, therefore what? Therefore what? No payment, which means what? No knas. That contradicts our Mishnah. Because our Mishnah said that if a man violates his sister, what's the halacha? Knas. So what's going on over here? Amr Ula, lo kasha, not a contradiction. Kan ba'chosa nara, kan ba'chosa bogeres. Interesting, I was saying. Two different cases. Remember, we saw this in the Mishnah. We actually made reference to this, but we haven't really gone deep into it, which is the din of knas for violating a woman only applies to a woman who is a na'ara, doesn't apply to a woman who is a bogeres. For now, we are just taking that as a gzeras hakasiv, just a law in the Torah. Why? How? What? We'll get into that. So we'll say the Gemara says it's not a contradiction. When our Mishnah says that there's a kinas, it's talking about an ara. When the Mishnah in Makos says that if you violate your sister, you have to go, you get malchus. What does that mean? The sister is what? The sister is a bogeres. So because she's a bogeres, therefore again there's no kinas. So the Gemara says as follows. What is that? What is that? The Artmans bring like the best stuff to shir. What's happening? Good stuff. Wow. Okay, incredible. All right, so the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says, but 1 second. Take a look. Have a look at that, by the way. I don't know what it is. Iced tea. What'd you get? Like a mixologist for the breakfast? What did you? Yeah, ridiculous. You want like a little umbrella for that or something? All right. So the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says, 1 second. Bogeres nami ha'ika boshes upigam. I'll say, but 1 second. Even if you want to set up the Mishnah Meseches Makos as talking about a bogeres, it's talking about a bogeres, and therefore again there's no kinas. I both say there are still other payments. In other words, the Mishnah Meseches Makos makes it sound like that if a man violates his sister, there's no payments, there's only malchus. So okay, you want to tell me that the Mishnah Meseches Makos is talking about the sister who's a bogeres. Okay, if she's a bogeres, halacha l'maaseh, then I know there's no knas. But I both say, when a man violates a woman, there's a whole bunch of other payments involved also. The Gemara says, ha'ika, boshes subagan. And I both say, boshes literally is humiliation. Pegam is depreciation. And I will say, how do you gauge depreciation? So the truth is, it's very simple. We gauge it as if a woman was being sold as a maidservant. Then what would be the difference in her value prior to the violation versus post the violation? So that's called depreciation. So even if halacha l'maaseh there's no kinas, there's still other financial payments, to which most is incredible. To which the Gemara says, bishota. Bishota, we're talking about a woman who's insane, lacks capacity. And I will say this is fascinating. Now, what happens halacha lemaisa if she's a shota? So we're assuming right now she has no bosha, she has no humiliation. Which is such an incredible thing, right? Humiliation is a function of awareness and capacity. If you're a shota, then what? You really don't realize anything. I will say there might be a good mussar in that also, that sometimes in life it's good to be a shota. Right? Sometimes in life it's good, at least if you're not released, to pretend to be oblivious to certain things, because it's so much easier to let things just slide right off you. So the shota, interestingly enough, has no boshes, has no humiliation. The shota also has no pegam, no depreciation. Why? Because the assumption is that in general, a shota, if she were to be sold as a maidservant, would not really fetch anything on the slave market. I vahoiket Sarah. What about Tsar? We will say Tsar is pain and suffering. What about that? To which the Gemara says, "B'mafuta." Oh, we're talking about a case where she was seduced, not violated. See, the case of tsar, of physical suffering, is only a situation where she was violated. But halacha lamaisa, if she was seduced, then we assume there's no tsar. To which the Gemara says, "Hashta da asis lahachi." Now that you've gone ahead and come to this, afilu tema achoso na'ara. You could even go ahead and say that the Mishnah Makkos is talking about a sister who's a nara, and it could be a soma, where she doesn't have a father, therefore the money goes to her. Umafuta, and ultimately she's seduced. Alma kasavru. Both say, what do you see according to Ula? Kol heicha diika mamon malchus, mamon mishalim milkalalaki. Now both say this is very important because this is going to follow us for the rest of today's daf and into tomorrow's daf as well. The position of Ula. So we'll say, just to understand, what we're doing is we're working through our concepts. So in the previous sugya, we were totally focused on what? Which concept? Kimle b'derabamine. 2 punishments. I incur them simultaneously. You get the more severe one. The secondary one kind of is just dispensed with. Now, Ula is introducing something new. If you do something that generates a liability for mammon and malchus, monetary payment and malchus, Ula says, you pay the money, you don't get the malchus. So I will say what's happening over here is, therefore, Ula says, the case in malchus that we just said before, of where a man violates his sister and he gets malchus, according to Ula, we're setting that up as a case where there's no financial liability. So whatever the case would be, it's a shota or it's a nara who is seduced. So therefore, again, no financial liability. If there's no financial liability, then you get malchus. But I will say the shita of Ula is that whenever you have a liability of both mammon and malchus, you pay the money and you're exempted from the malchus. So I'll say, watch this. Minale the Ulaha. So where does Ula get this from? Where does he get this from? To which the Gemara says, Gamar, we'll say, it's interesting, Musar, no? You know how, like, after a fast day, you appreciate everything so much more, right? A person has a glass of water on any given day, and, like, it's a glass of water, right? I will say, isn't it incredible? Like, mamish, like, you could be like you're drinking from the be'er of Miriam in the desert. Like, that's, I'm just saying, like, to be able to hold on to that, like, it's the same. It's no different than persons driving and they get like almost get into an accident. Like in that moment, your eyes are opened up and you have so much akar satov to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for always watching over you. How long does it last for? Right? Yeah, I was going to say 4.5 minutes. Okay, say it's like 10 minutes, right? The point is, see, we ultimately in life, we have like these epiphanies, we have these awakenings, and the goal in life is to be able to hold on to them and to hold on to that, because the truth is, a person should appreciate a cup of water each and every day, just like a person should appreciate ultimately the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu watches over them every day. It's incredible. So where does Ula know this from? That whenever an act generates a dual liability of mammon and malchus, you pay the money and you're exempted from the malchus. To which the Gemara says, Gamar mechovel bechavero. It will say this is learned out from the case of chovel bechavero. It's learned out ultimately from the person who injures his friend. This is very interesting. Mach Shabbos, the Gemara says, what's chovel bechavero? Mach chovel bechavero di ika mammon malchus. So let's listen to this. When you injure your friend, right? I guess it's not your friend, right? When you go ahead and you injure another Jew, there's dual liability. What's the dual liability? Number 1, a din of malchus. Number 2, a din of mammon. Then Abba said, let's work backwards. Mammon, I understand, right? I go ahead and I damage Ruvain. There's a din of mammon. What's the money? What's the mammon? Oh, again, it could be a number. There's 5 different categories of damages that we're going to talk about that in just a moment. So there's damages. There's also malchus. And I will say, why do you get malchus for injuring another Jew? This is incredible. Look at Rashi. Chovo bechavero. Ika malchus de lo Yosef. This is incredible. They both say there is a lav of Lo Yosef, which says that when Beis Din goes ahead and administers malchus to someone, Beis Din goes ahead and has they have a guy on staff. I don't know what you call him. I guess maybe you'd call him like the court physician. And what's his job? What's his job? His job is to assess the guy who's going to be flogged. And he has to come along and say, this guy is capable of getting 26 malchus. Good kevavke, right? 26 malchus. That's what he's able to get. So the halacha is that once the defendant, not defendant, once the perpetrator, good, the perpetrator, right? Once he goes in and gets that number of malchus, then the halacha is you're not allowed to add on. And if you add on more, that's a lav. Supposed to listen to this. When you go ahead and you hit another Jew, you're in violation of Lo Yosef, right? Why? Listen to this. What's the logic? Because if I go over to Ruvain, I'm hitting him. Was Ruvain liable, right? Did Ruvain deserve that patch? I mean, of course, I think he did, right? But Lamaisa, halachically, he did not. Therefore, again, I am in violation of the lav of Lo Yosef. Incredible, no? So listen to this. So I go over, I damage Ruvain. So anytime I hit Ruvain and I damage him, so there's dual liability. Liability number one for Malchus, because of the lav of Lo Yosef, and ultimately Mamon. So we'll say, what's the halacha? What's the halacha? So the Gemara says, Mamon Mishalim Milka Lo Lucky. Ultimately, the halacha is in that case that we make the person pay, and ultimately he doesn't get Malchus. I will say that's the halacha, and I will say at the end of the day, that becomes the paradigm. That becomes the paradigm. Therefore, any case where there is dual liability to both Mammon and Malchus, you'll pay the money and exempt it from the Malchus. Af kol heicha diika Mammon and Malchus, Mammon and Mishalim, Milka Lo Lucky. So to any case where there's dual liability of Mammon and Malchus, you'll go ahead and pay the money, don't get the Malchus. Tuition was 1 second. 1 second. If you go ahead and you injure your friend, that's a separate halacha. I'm chayiv in 5 things. What are the 5 things I'm chayiv for? I will say, if you take a look at Rashi, Rashi's almost right across, about 8 lines down. Shechayiv bechamisha dvarim, nezek, tsar, ripui, sheves, uboshes. So we'll say nezek is damages, tsar is pain and suffering, ripui is medical bills, sheves, lost wages, boshes, humiliation. Boshes, humiliation. So when you injure someone, that automatically opens up the door to these 5 categories of damages. Maybe you'll say that halacha lamaisa, well, in general, money, payment of money is looked at as a kula. Not necessarily true. Shekein hutar michlalo bebeis din. I will say maybe malchus is a kula. Why? Maybe malchus is considered to be more kal, because I will say malchus is something that is administered by a beis din. So because it's administered by a beis din, maybe it's looked at as a bit more kal. Ela gamar meidim zomer. So we'll say, so just to keep our eye on the ball over here, we have a very simple task. What are we trying to figure out? We're trying to figure out where Ula gets his principle from. What's the principle of Ula? That whenever you go ahead and do an act which generates dual liability for Mammon and Malchus, Ula says, what's the halacha? What's the halacha? Pay the money, exempted from the Malchus. All we're trying to do right now is figure out how do we know that. To which the Gemara says, let's go right there. Says the Gemara, Ela Gomer Me'edim Zomin. Ula learns that from Edim Zomin. So we'll say, remember again, what's our case of Edim Zomin? What's our case of Edim Zomin? Remember again, witnesses show up. They say Reuven killed Shimon. What happens? Another pair of witnesses show up. What do they say to the first pair? Imanu Hayisem. Now remember again, the second pair of witnesses who show up are not testifying at all to whether or not Reuven killed Shimon. They have no idea Reuven killed Shimon. What do they know? What do they know? That the first set of witnesses cannot have seen what they claim to have seen. So I will say, watch this. Edim Zomin. Ma Edim Zomimin di'ika Mammon and Malchus. Then I will say Edim Zomimin in general have both financial liability and Malchus. Now let's work backwards. I will say now financial liability comes up in a case where the Edim testified, let's say that Reuven owed $10,000 to Shimon. So if it's shown to be Edim Zomimin, then what's the halacha? There's reciprocal punishment. Then ultimately the Edim Zomin have to pay the $10,000. There's also Malchus. What's Malchus, Rabbi say? Because if you are a false witness, you are in violation of the 9th commandment of Losana Bereacha Eid Shaker, of not bearing false witness. So Edim Zomin is often a situation where you have dual liability, financial liability, and Malchus. And Rabbi say, what's the halacha? So the Gemara says, Elagaram Edim Zomin, my Edim Zomin, the Ika Mammon Malchus, Mammon Mashali Milka Lo Lucky. So Rabbi say, Edim Zomin, we know the halacha is that remember, the Edim, they pay the money, they pay the reciprocal punishment, and they don't get Malchus. Af kol hecha deika mamona malkis, mamona mishalim milka lo lucky. So too, Rabbi Ula says this is a paradigm, and the paradigm is there for any case where there is dual liability of mamona malkis. Pay the money, don't get the malchus. One second. One second. I will say Edom Zoman is different. Why is Edom Zoman different? Because Edom Zoman are unique in that they don't need hasra'ah. They do not need warning. Now I will say we're going to talk about that more. What does that mean? Edom Zoman don't need hasra'ah. In general, any time that you want to go ahead and generate liability, you generally have to issue a warning ahead of time. So we'll see what that means. V'i mamona lakula. And if you want to say that in general, financial payment ultimately is considered to be more lenient, shekein lo asu maisa. So the Gemara says, 1 second, Edom Zoman are dramatically different. Why? Because halacha la maisa, they didn't do anything. Now, say, what does it mean Edom Zoman didn't do anything? Now, say, what have Edom Zoman done? Right? What have Edom Zoman done? They spoke. Dibor, speech, is not a maisa. It's not an action. Now, say, an incredible Moshe Haskell. Because in general, we know this in life. Speaking about what you're going to do means absolutely nothing. You could espouse the most beautiful life plans, espouse the most beautiful ideas, ideals, and aspirations. But if you fail to execute, all the words in the world mean absolutely nothing. So the Gemara says, therefore, Edom Zoman is unique because halacha l'maisa were punishing people even though they actually didn't do anything. Ella, so here, remember, let's just kind of bring this all together. Here's what we've got. We've got Ula. And what is Ula teaching us? That anytime halacha l'maisa, one act generates a dual liability of both mammon and malchus. What's the halacha? Pay, don't get malchus. Gemara is trying to figure out, Ula, where do you get that from? So the Gemara has floated two possibilities. What was possibility A? Chovel bechavero. Person hits and injures his friend. So again, you hit and injure your friend, there's dual liability. Number one, damages, compensatory damages, mammon, and also malchus, because ultimately, lo yosef, you've struck someone who did not deserve it. That's a lav. And we see over there that the halacha is they pay, and ultimately, again, don't get malchus. The Gemara says, but there's a stringency in that case over there. Finally, the Gemara brought Edom Zomamin. What happens to Edom Zomamin? When you have Edom Zomamin, dual liability. Number one, malchus, because they testified falsely. That's a lav. And number two, in a case where they're testifying about money, the reciprocal punishment will make them liable to money. And we see that in that case, halacha l'maisa what? They pay, they don't get malchus. What's the problem with the Edom Zomamin case? Is ultimately, again, number one, they don't get asra. Number two, there's no maisa. To which the Gemara says, you're right. To which the Gemara says, ma'atzad ela gamar meitar vayhu. The truth is, Ula learns out his principle from a combination of both of these two cases. How so? Ma'atzad hasheva sheba handi ika mamona malchus, mamona mishalim milka lo lucky. They both say, what's the common denominator between chovel bechavero, injuring your friend, and Edom Zomamin? What's the common denominator? Both are cases where there's dual liability, and both are cases where what? You pay the money, and you're exempted from the malchus. So I will say, what we could do is we could combine the two of them to create a paradigm. Af kol heicha diika mamona malchus, mamona mishalim milka lo lucky. I'll create a paradigm, and what's the paradigm? So to any case where there is dual liability of mammon and malchus, ultimately pay the money, and you don't get the malchus. So we'll say, so that's what the Gemara wants to say. You can't learn out from either of them, but if I join them both together, chovel bechavero and Edom Zomamin, create a common denominator. They're both subject to mammon and malchus, yet in both cases, you only pay the mammon, you don't get the malchus. That creates the paradigm. So in any case where there is dual liability, mammon and malchus, money, compensatory damages, and malchus lashes, you'll pay the money and you're exempted from the malchus. To which the Gemara says, one second. Maybe the common denominator is that both of them have a unique stringency. To which the Gemara says, V'i mamona lakula hu shekin yeshban sadakal. So I will say, and if you want to say ultimately again that mammon is a kula, maybe the common denominator between both of them is that they both have a leniency. Ella amud beis, I will say, lamud beis amud beis. Ella ula. So I will say, so therefore again, we're still stuck. Namely, we are trying to figure out what's the source for Ula's halacha. What's the source? Ula says that once again, whenever you commit an act that results in dual liability, mammon and malchus, you pay the money, you're exempted from the malchus. We're trying very hard to figure out where does Ula get this from. We have been unsuccessful so far. Ella Ula tachas gamar. Here we go, I will say. Ula makes a gzeira shava of tachas. How so? What is this? Ksiv hacha tachas asher ina. It says over here by the man who goes ahead and violates a woman that what's the halacha tachas asher ina. He has to pay the chamishim kesef. He has to pay the knas of the 50 pieces. Ultimately, again, because he violated, because he afflicted her. Uksiv hasam, and I will say it says over there, ayin tachas ayin. Both say pashas mishpatim, an eye for an eye. Now we know, of course, eye for an eye is not literal. Ma hasam mamona mishali milka lo laki. And both say in a case of an eye for an eye, what's the halacha? A person blind, Ruvain blinds Shimon. I both say what's the halacha? What's the halacha? Ruvain pays Shimon, and Ruvain doesn't get malchus. So we see from there, that even though halacha l'maisa, when you go ahead and you blind someone, technically speaking, there's dual liability, there's damages, but also the act of injuring someone by definition results in malchus. Yet the halacha is you only pay, you don't get malchus. So af kol hecha diika mamona umalchus mamona mishalim milka lo laki. So I will say, it turns out over here that halacha l'maisa, the way the Gemara's understanding is that according to Ula, he's learning a gzeir shava of tachas. It says tachas in the case of the man who violates a woman. It says tachas in the case, ultimately, again, of ayin tachas ayin. Just like ayin tachas ayin results in dual liability, but you only have to pay, you don't get malchus. So to will apply that to the case of the man who violates the woman. And now that I have those two cases, halacha l'maisa, that creates a paradigm. That creates a paradigm that halacha l'maisa, whenever there is a case that results in dual liability of mammon and malchus, you'll pay the money, you're exempted from the malchus. Beautiful. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Rabbi Yochanan says, if Shabbos say now, Rabbi Yochanan is going back. We're jumping back now. How do we start the new sugya today? How do we start? We start with a contradiction between our Mishnah and the Mishnah in Makkas. Right? Remember again, our Mishnah says that if a man violates his sister, what's the halacha? What's the halacha? He pays the knas. Pays the knas. The Mishnah in Makkas says he gets malchus. So we had a whole Ula essentially explained the way that he explained that it's not a contradiction. So now the Gemara says Rabbi Yochanan has a different approach. Rabbi Yochanan Amar afilu tema achoso nara. Rabbi Yochanan says the truth is you could even assume that both Mishnayos are talking about a nara. So what's the case? Kansha hisrubo, kansha lo hisrubo. Interesting distinction. Rabbi Yochanan will say one is a case where you got hasra, and one was a case where you did not get hasra. So apparently, again, in a case where you got hasra, you can get malchus. In a case where you didn't get hasra, you don't get malchus. Alma kasav Rabbi Yochanan. So we'll say, here we go. Therefore, Rabbi Yochanan holds, Kol heicha diika mamona malchus va'asru bei. In any case where you committed an act which results in dual liability of mammon and malchus, and you got hasra, milka lucky, mamona lo mashalim. You get malchus and you don't pay. So I will say the exact opposite of ula. Fundamental machlokes, dramatic, riveting, overwhelming, earth-shaking machlokes, Rabbi Yochanan and Ula. See, here we go, Abosai. And again, it's all based on how they interpret the stira, the contradiction between the two Mishnayos. So now Abosai, what Rabbi Yochanan is saying is like this. Whenever you commit an act which results in dual liability, has right a malchus and mammon, Rabbi Yochanan holds, assuming there was hasra, you'll get the malchus and not pay the mammon. So we've got Ula who says whenever there's dual liability, pay the money, no malchus. Rabbi Yochanan, get the malchus, don't pay the money. Let's analyze. So where does Rabbi Yochanan know this from? Where does he know this from? Amar Kra, because the pasuk says, Kedei Rishaso, Mishum Risha'achas Atam Echai V'Yotam Echai Mishtei Mishtei Rishios. Because Rabbi Yochanan says like this. The pasuk says, the Gemara over here is quoting the pasuk, Vayam bin Akos HaRasha, the pilu hashofet, they call the fun of kedei rish aso. So I will say the pasuk itself is actually talking about the idea that halacha l'maaseh, when you flog someone, right, when you give them lashes, you're only allowed to give them the appointed number of lashes. Rabbi Yochanan is expanding this a little bit. Kedei rish aso, Rabbi Yochanan means kedei rish aso is singular. You give someone that which is in accordance with their rishos, with their evil behavior. Rabbi Yochanan says, what do you see from here? A person only gets one punishment per infraction. Per infraction. Okay. Now what comes right after that? V'samichle arba'im yakenu. We'll say, watch this. And what comes right after that pasuk? Malchus. So we'll say, what is Rabbi Yochanan learn from here? Rabbi Yochanan says, therefore, you only get one malchus, you only get one punishment. And therefore, again, right after that comes a discussion of malchus, which he uses to teach us. Therefore, when you did something which results in dual liability, if one of the two, you can only, how many punishments can you get? How many punishments can you get? One. What's the problem? Which one? Oh, so the Torah says right afterwards, Malchus. Since the Torah discusses Malchus right after Kidei Rishaso, Rabbi Yochanan says that teaches me that ultimately, again, when I can only get one punishment, the punishment I'm going to get is the punishment of Malchus. Incredible. So Rabbi say, so this is really dramatic. So we've got Rabbi Yochanan saying that Allah Maisa, whenever you go ahead and commit an act which results in dual liability, Mammon and Malchus, you're going to get the Malchus, you're going to be exempted from Mammon. What is it based on? Two-part drasha. Number one, Kidei Rishaso, you can only get one punishment per crime. But which one is it? Which one is it? The very next pasuk that talks about Malchus. So therefore, if one of the two punishments in question is Malchus, you're going to get Malchus, and the other one is dropped. So Rabbi say, now we're going to ask Rabbi Yochanan, what about the case of a person who injures his friend? What about the case of a person who injures his friend? And we just said before, when you injure your friend, Rabbi said that's dual liability. Number one, there's Malchus, because you hit him unnecessarily. Number two, there's Mammon, there's compensatory damages. And we know what's the halacha? The halacha is you pay, and you don't get Malchus. So Rabbi Yochanan, what do you do with this? Maybe that's talking about a case where there was no hasra, there was no warning. So where there's no warning, Rabbi Yochanan says that's when you pay instead of get Malchus. We'll say first wide line, Lamed Beis We're almost there, almost at the finish line. Aval asru bei, but if halacha lamaisi you get hasra, milka lucky mamor lo mishalim. So we'll say maybe Rabbi Yochanan makes this distinction. When do we say that a chovel bechaver, if you injure your friend, you pay mammon, you don't get malchus? That's when there was no hasra. But if there was hasra, if there was proper warning before the commission of the act, then halacha lamaisa you'll get malchus and you won't have to pay money. What about the following case? Right, Rabbi Ami said that if a person, most actually interesting case. Let's say I go over to Ruvain and I hit Ruvain. But I hit him in a way where it's a makkah that's less than a shava pruta. So, by the way, what's a good example of a makkah less than a shava pruta? Sometimes it's good to know. Right? What's a makkah less than a shava pruta where there's no halachic liability? You bruise someone. Right? I go over, I give someone like a massive dead arm. Right? And so, again, so I have a big bruise. Big bruise. Now, the truth is, there's no I guess today, depending on your lawyer, you may be able to get lost damages, lost companionship, right? My husband can't hug me, whatever, But lamaisa, at least from halacha, ultimately, again, there's no damages in that. There's no damages. So that's called an injury where there's not a shava pruta. Shabbos say, in that case, loke. So we'll say, now there is a good case, because there's no monetary damages. Therefore what? You get malchus. So hechi dami, what's the case? Idolo asrube, if there was no hasra, amai loke, then ultimately again, why would there be malchus? Elapshita da asrube. It must be that there was hasra. Now 1 second. Because there was hasra, the time of the less shava pruta. The reason you're going to get malchus is because the damages were not a shava pruta. Ha is pe shava pruta, but it sounds like over here that if you damage the person in the way that was a shava pruta, mamona mishalim milka lo lucky, that even in that case there would be financial compensation, not malchus. That contradicts Rabbi Yochanan. Kids to which the Gemara says, no, it's not a problem. Kedam Rabbi Eloi beferish rib satora edim zomamin letashlumin hacha nami beferish rib satora chovel bechavero letashlumin. So Rabbi say, listen to this. Rabbi Yochanan subscribes to the position of Rabbi Eloi. What does Rabbi Eloi say? Rabbi Eloi says, Rabbi say that the same way that the Torah goes out of its way to teach me that Edim Zomamin always have to pay and don't get malchus, so too the Torah goes out of its way to explicitly say that when a person injures his fellow, halacha lamaisa, there's always damages and never malchus. But let's just do 2 more lines. Vehecha itmad Rabbi Eloi. Where did Rabbi Eloi make this statement? Me'idin anues ish ploni shechayiv lechavero masayim zuz. But listen to this. We testify, so 2 witnesses come along. They say, we're testifying that Reuven owes Shimon 200 zuz. The name Tzu Zomamin. But it turns out then that another set of witnesses come and say to the first 2, you can't be testifying about that loan because you said that loan happened at 10:30 on Sunday night. And 10:30 on Sunday night, you were with us. Imanu hayisem. What's talacha? The name Tzu Zomamin. Lokin umishalmin. Listen to this. They get malchus and they have to pay. Why? Because what Rameir says like this. Do you know why they go out and they get both? Because it's 2 separate infractions. Rabbi say, remember again, they get malchus. Why? Why malchus? ninth commandment. Lo sana breacha et shakir. You can't be a false witness. And why do they get mammon? Why do they get mammon? That's the din of Eidim Zomamin. So Meir says it's two different infractions. There's no like killing b'drab minei. There's two different infractions. They violate therefore they have to pay twice. Listen to this. The Chachamim omrim kala mishalim eino loke. The Chachamim say no. Any person who pays, by definition, doesn't get malchus. I v'nema kala loke eino mishalim. Why don't we just say just the opposite? Why don't we say that any person who gets malchus doesn't pay? In other words, I got it. The Chachamim are going to say you only get one punishment. But how do you know that the punishment you get is money and not malchus? You could just as easily say it's malchus, not money. Here we go. Amar Rabbi Eloi, beferish ribs Torah, edim zomin letashlumin. Because the Torah explicitly said that edim zomin have to pay. Where did the Torah explicitly say this? Heichan ribs Torah. So we'll say, here we go. Michtik siv. The pasuk says, vasisim lo kasher zamam lasos liachiv. The pasuk says that you shall do to the eid zomim that which he wanted to do to his brother. Listen to this. Yad biyad lamali. Then Rabbi say, here's the problem. The pasuk says, should we just read you the psukim, because the psukim are one right after the other. Vasisim lo kasher zamam lasos liachiv. Right? When somebody is proven to be an eid zomim, there's reciprocal punishment. You do to him that which you wanted to do to the defendant. Right after that, the pasuk says, "V'lo sachus einecha nefesh b'nefesh, ayin ba'ayin, shein b'shein, yad b'yad." So the Torah says, don't look away from punishing the eid zomim. Do whatever you have to do, yad b'yad. What's yad b'yad? What does that mean? To which Rabbi Eloi says something amazing. Yad b'yad lamali, davar hanitan miyad liyad. Teaches me about something that's handed from one hand to the other. I will say, what's handed from one hand to the other? Umay nihu, mammon. Mammon. So you see from here, says Rabbi Eloi, that even in a case where there's a chi of malchus, ultimately, again, there's still going to be a chi of mammon. So I will say, we're going to stop over here for tonight, but let's just be clear. Let's just be clear where we're stopping, right? So remember, again, we are in the midst of a fundamental machlokes. Actually, all right, yeah, fine, we'll stop here. So we'll say, yeah, okay, I got it. And I'm getting the signal. Let's just clarify just where we're leaving off over here, right? So remember, again, what we're leaving off with over here is a fundamental machlokes, Rabbi Yochanan and Ula, right? In terms of when I commit an act that generates dual liability. In this case, the dual liability is mammon, financial obligation, and malchus, lashes. So which one do I get? We're assuming right now you're not going to get both, although we'll see a third school of thought as well. Ula says, when you get both, when there's a dual liability, pay the money, don't get the malchus. We went through Ula's entire drasha. Rabbi Yochanan comes along and says, halacha l'maisa, no. When there's dual liability, you get the malchus, you don't get the mammon. But what we are coming to see over here is that according to Rabbi Yochanan, there are certain exceptions to that rule. And there are namely two exceptions. What are the two exceptions? Eidim zomamin, where even if you're chayiv malchus, you're still going to have to pay money. And number two, chovel bechavero, damaging your friend. Those will be the two exceptions to Rabbi Yochanan's rule. And Rabbi said it's based on Rabbi Eloi. Rabbi Eloi espouses those two exceptions. We saw the first of those two exceptions, Eidim Zomamin. Why Eidim Zomamin? Even though there's a chi of malchus, there's still going to be a din of mamon, yad biyad. And Miras Hashem, tomorrow morning, B'Shah Tov Mitzlachos, we'll see the second of the two exceptions, and then Miras Hashem get to the halacha l'maisa in this machlokes. Rabosai, shkoyach. 6 a.m. tomorrow. 6 Ben Azmanim. 6 a.m. Yeah, this is nice. Let's keep it this way. I know. This is nice.